Department of Computer Science.
And faculty also.
Oh, I see. Yeah, it didn't look like he was young.
Yeah, one is our MIT force. So these are the people who collect all those information and communicate. And then we have an editorial board. And all those contexts we will just run through our students.
Okay.
And only the faculty advisor, it is only not what not to do, that's all. And what to do, they will decide. That is the only thing. And we also have a Manipal journal. And this is again originated and housed in our
Sir, it is often said by many Indians that Britishers brought in discipline amongst Indians. So what is your take on that?
What is discipline? There are various kinds of silence, right? There's a silence of calm and contemplation. There is a silence of the graveyard. Similarly, there is a discipline that comes from self-motivation, self-control, and there is discipline that comes with a foreigner's stick or gun. So that kind of discipline, perhaps they may have brought in some places. But I think that I have far greater respect and value for our own capacity to organize ourselves and motivate ourselves to do the right thing.
How do you feel when the Prime Minister of India invited you to be a part of Swachh Bharat Andolan?
Well, I must admit that knowing the politics of our country, because by then I'd been in politics for 5 years, so some of the earlier naive mistakes I made in my first couple of years had educated me that one must be a little attentive. I was conscious of the risk of this having certain political consequences. On the substance of the sanitation drive, I honestly didn't think it was controversial at all because I was familiar with the fact that Gandhiji had said before independence that sanitation is more important than independence. That every single government of India from the 1947 onwards had a sanitation program. The name had changed periodically. Rural sanitation program, total sanitation program, Bharat Nirman. But there had always been an emphasis on cleaning India. It was just that it had never been given this kind of visibility and prominence, and Narendra Modi was proposing to give it. And I thought that therefore this would be a politically uncontroversial way of moving forward. And in any case, I unfortunately for me happened to be far away from India. I was on a plane to Romania when the decision was announced. I landed in Romania, my phone's ringing off the hook and everyone telling me this news. I tried to figure out what the sort of party position was, and I unfortunately came across a statement by a party spokesman welcoming it and saying Mr. Modi should have invited more congressmen to join. So thinking that this must have been a well-considered line, I thought, well then there is no problem, the party doesn't mind, and I had accepted it. By then, in any case, because of my hours on the plane, I was the only one of the 9 ambassadors named by Mr. Modi who had not accepted. So there was already a lot of tweets and messages saying, why are you holding out, why are you being petty, why are you putting politics before the issue? So I said, no, they should be happy to do so, but I was very careful in announcing my acceptance to make 2 points very clear. One is the one I've just made, that there is a national consensus on the importance of sanitation going back before independence, and that therefore I read no political meaning into it. And the second thing I said is that, and I said this already on Twitter on the first day itself, is that I'm not a believer in photo op politics. That is, Swachh Bharat boils down to a number of grandees or VIPs picking up a broom on October 2nd and never touching a broom again till the cameras roll around the next October 2nd. If that was going to be the case, then I didn't see much point in associating with it. But given all the assurances that this would be taken seriously, there would be more funding given to it, the Swachh Bharat Kosh was being talked about, there was a lot of enthusiasm that the Prime Minister was bringing into the venture. I thought it was right to do. I did write a very detailed article the very next day on ndtv.com in which I spelled out some important background that I understood about sanitation programs, what had worked, what had not worked, the fact that in UP something like 70-odd% of the new toilets constructed in the previous 5 years were sitting unused because people still had the cultural practice or the habit of going into the fields, and so on and so forth. I got into some detail on this. It wasn't just a ill-considered, but nonetheless you're right that politically it was not fully appreciated by many who unfortunately misunderstood. And that's why when I did my project, as it were, which was to clean up a beach in my constituency, I chose a Muslim area. I associated the local community strongly with the cleanup, made them come and join me. I said, you are the stakeholders, you are the ones who have to wake up and live here, not me. So you come. I got the local Muslim Jamaat to sign up. And I got the Congress Party workers from that particular area to associate themselves and to join me in the cleanup. So that I tried to diffuse the allegation that this was a BJP project by doing it in a very un-BJP area. But that's all part of the political reality of it.
I'm allowed just one question, sir, but I've waited 9 years for this.
Oh
so
my
I'm
God.
going to ask 3 questions, clubbed as one. I'd like you to keep in mind all the 3 questions as I go through them. The first question is, Antonio Guterres took over as the United Nations Secretary General. He was the High Commissioner for Refugees before that. You have worked with the High Commissioner for Refugees. In fact, you started working for the United Nations in Singapore, working for the boat people, the Vietnamese refugees. Today we have another set of boat people out there in the sea, the Rohingyas. The Indian government is doing very little about the Rohingya crisis, and you brought out the asylum seekers bill in 2015 that was squashed. What more, as you, as the chairman of the at the Standing Committee for External Affairs, the Parliamentary Committee, what more do you think that you or the Indian government for that matter can do in this case? Number one. Number two, you talk of atonement for the sins of the British Raj in your book, Out of Darkness, Era of Darkness, and also you talk about the same in your speech in the Oxford Union debate that got famous. I would like to talk about how Jeremy Corbyn talked about how his history books in his country are dishonest about their past. Do you think our history books are dishonest in the same ways? Do you see our history books getting more of the Tamil crisis, more of the Kashmiri crisis into our realm of history? Do you see an Indian Prime Minister going to Aizawl and apologizing to the citizens for the bombings of 1966? That is my second question. My third question is, when you gave a speech in JNU right up in the aftermath of the Rohit Vemula incident and the Kanhaiya Kumar incident, you gave this 1.5 hour long speech that I went through. And in that you talked about how Kerala was the place, Kerala was a place back in the days where people were very accepting of other cultures. Some of the first Jewish persecuted Jews came to Kerala, some of the first Muslims came to Kerala, some of the first Christians came to Kerala. And how the Indian community in such, when you go back in time, was a very pluralistic place. What I find disturbing in your comparisons is that when the right-wing ideology goes back in the past and talks of how we, back in the day, were much better than what we are right now. And when you, in your book, talk of woven air in the Muslim clothes of Bengal, or you talk of secularism being integral to the Indian society, I look back and I see my grandfather discriminating against the Dalit. I look back and I see my uncle maybe discriminating against the Muslim in the village next door, and I don't see any plurality in my India, in the past of my India. Do you think it is better for us to take the German example of understanding that we have sins to atone for ourselves and start afresh rather than go ahead and tell them of a past that may not be shared by the whole of the country? So
these are excellent questions. They deserve lengthier answers than I'm told I have time to give you. I've been whispered to that I have to wrap up very quickly. I'll be as brief as I can, effectively. On the refugee issue, slightly wrong one or two of the details. I didn't begin in Singapore, I began in Europe, then I moved to Singapore and had the office there. And I didn't work with Guterres himself because I left the UN in 2007, beginning after my race for Secretary in 2006. But he only started in 2006, so our overlap was very minimal. But I do know him and I think very highly of him, and I wish him well in his job. I would say that as far as the Rohingyas are concerned, I'm one of the very few MPs who has raised his voice on the particular issue. I've written to the Prime Minister, I've written to the Home Minister, and I've written to the Foreign Minister. The Foreign Minister announced a grant of $1 million, but to the government of Burma, not to help the refugees. She was helping the government of Burma, and they're the ones who are driving out the refugees, burning their settlements, jacking them and so on. So I'm very concerned about the Indian government not living up to its own humanitarian traditions vis-a-vis these people. There's need for assistance to the Rohingyas in Delhi, and there is also need for the Rohingya people to benefit from a credible legal framework in India which doesn't exist, which is why my refugee and asylum law is, I believe, of some value in this situation. Strictly speaking, this doesn't come within the purview of the External Affairs Committee because the grant of asylum would be seen as a Home Affairs issue. But I will find I'm exploring some ways of getting the government to be a little more conscious of this issue. And all I can say, as they like to say in America, is watch this space. I haven't given up on this issue because it is an important one. Secondly, on atonement, yeah, I mean, I pointed out that one of the things the British should do is to teach the truth to their children. The week this book came out in India, there was an article by a Pakistani journalist whom I don't know personally, in The Guardian, who had brought up 2 children in London in the best public school, which, as you know, is a private school in London, Westminster. And she said they'd majored in history and they hadn't learned the line of colonial history. You know, the British are in denial about their own past. There's a deliberate historical amnesia about their oppression, exploitation, and loot of foreign countries, which, frankly, I think it's time that they actually accept, because the truth is that London would not look like this today if it were not for the proceeds of their exploitation of foreign peoples in India and elsewhere, the Caribbean and so on. Slavery, the whole lot. A lot of money came into Britain to build London, to start off the Industrial Revolution. So I'm in favor of atonement on their part. As far as your specific question about India is concerned, I have no problem in any case with any Indian ruler apologizing to his own people. I would have been very much in favor of a much earlier apology to the Sikhs in '84, to victims of any riots in this country. I don't think that a Prime Minister is in any case acknowledging any personal guilt. It is just an apology for those who feel it is needed. I mean, I don't know whether in Aizawl there is a demand. If there is such a demand, I think the first time that a Prime Minister or a senior Indian minister goes, they should assuage the pain of any people who are still feeling that pain. Mind you, that was 50 years ago. The fact still is there have been other insurgencies. We may not apologize for acting against insurgency in the name of national unity, but for any wrongs done, any atrocities committed, we should certainly apologize. I would have no difficulty demanding that myself if there were comparable cases. But I want to stress one thing which I've tried to do in the context of the book as well, that history should be faced in its own terms and for itself, but it belongs in the past. Learn the past, appreciate the past, understand the past, but leave it in the past. To my mind, there has to be some limits. There's a very famous lecture by the historian Ernest Renan in 1882 about nationalism. It's a classic for those who have studied all this. And Renan argues that one of the most important things in nation building is not only memory, it's forgetting. He says if the French people had not allowed themselves to forget the massacres in the Midi and so on that took place in forging what became the French nation, French nationality, French unity would be impossible. There'd still be grudges and memories going back to the past. So at some point you have to leave the past, but that's what I've said to the people in the Ram Janmabhoomi agitation. I don't want to argue about whether there really was a temple there or not, which is the plane at which the secular historians are arguing. My argument is different. You believe there was a temple, let us assume you were right there was a temple. Is it right for you today to take out the consequences of the destruction of that temple on people 600 years later, 500 years later, 400 years later, whatever it may be, who had nothing to do with whatever may or may not have happened at that time? That's the difference. And then your third question, I'm trying to follow each of your questions, you had so much to ask. Quickly give me a one sentence reminder.
The third question was about how you were drawing parallels of
oh yeah, you say you don't see any pluralism in India. Yeah. Now you're being you're being frankly a bit cynical, because the India that I describe is as real as the India that you describe. When both are there. I've often joked to foreign audiences that anything I can tell you about India, the opposite is also true. So, we are the country which has done more to oppress women than you can imagine in the most appalling ways, but we're also the country which produced the world's first woman lawyer. The very first lawyer to get a degree from Oxford University was an Indian woman. And Oxford had never given a woman a degree, they had no provision to give a woman a degree. So she had to wait 30 years after her graduation to get the degree. But she was the first one in 1866, Cornelius Horaji. So the first woman in the world to get a lawyer's degree is an Indian. Some of the first female doctors in the world were Indians. Some of the first pilots in the world were Indians. First CEOs in the world, amongst the first heads of government in the world. So are you going to look only at those facts and say that women have it great in India? Or are you only going to look at the opposite and say women are terribly oppressed? Then how do you point to Indira Gandhi, how do you point to Cornelius Horaji, etc.? you have to point out ours is a large country where both tendencies have been allowed to prevail, but that we have to support the right ones, or what we deem to be the right ones. Similarly, as far as pluralism is concerned, what I'm saying has been said by Swami Vivekananda, has been said by Jawaharlal Nehru in the discovery of India. Everyone has talked about the pluralism of India, and the examples are multiple. But if you also want examples of discrimination, oppression, injustice, I can give you examples that are multiple. Same thing on every other issue. You can take the Hindu-Muslim divide, take caste oppression, take anything. There are arguments on both sides. You choose what you want to look at, you choose what you want to celebrate and affirm, you choose what is the kind of India you want to belong to and celebrate and fight for. All of us are making those choices every day, and the India that I celebrate is the India that I believe in, that I want to see gaining the upper hand over the other 10 skills that anybody can acquire in any profession. Because the ability to express yourself plays a role in almost anything you can accomplish in any kind of profession. Whether you're in a commercial company dealing with a client or a consumer, whether you're in a bureaucracy or hierarchical organization expressing a point of view to a boss, whether you are a boss trying to explain things to a subordinate so they're done properly, whether you are trying to move an audience, persuade someone to do something different, even get a girl to go out with you. The fact is, expressing yourself and conveying what you feel, what you think, what you believe effectively is the key to getting ahead in literally any activity. So to my mind, there is no greater skill that you can learn at any stage of your life than the art of communicating effectively, and ideally, of course, oral communication, because that tends to reach people more easily and in larger numbers than written communication. Though obviously, I am a great believer in written communication also, but the truth is that speaking is very important. I was very pleased that my father understood this early on. Most children are reluctant to do anything anyway that takes them out of their comfort zone, but he forced me into debating and speaking at a very young age, and it was his driving me that got me into this, and eventually looking back in my life, I've said this to my kids as well, it's the single most useful asset, I think, that I've been able to acquire. So whether one does it in the formal structured debate format or just in your daily life, think more clearly because you have to marshal your thoughts to express them properly. Your vocabulary improves because you need the right words to say the right things. Your manner of communication improves with your practice. And ultimately, your success rate at getting what you want in life also improves because you obviously personally a strong believer in value education, and I've got 4 degrees to my name that I earned the hard way and a few honorary degrees that I earned without really doing anything for them. But the fact is that having those qualifications speaks to having made the effort to study, to learn, to master large areas of information, to process that information, to acquire insights and focus, etc. And those qualities are useful in governance because people in governance are constantly taking decisions that affect millions of us, and it will be good to feel that they have the capacity to fully think through the problems that they're addressing and to make decisions having understood the implications and the consequences rather than merely what may be a political benefit or short-term value to them. So governance benefits from education, yes, up to a point. But when I say only up to a point, that's because in a democracy, ultimately it is not whether the person is educated that matters, it's ultimately whether, it's ultimately whether the people who are voting in a democracy for the policies that they wish to be governed by, that those people also feel a connect to the person and that they also feel that he or she is responsive to their needs and wishes. And there, sometimes the most educated person may also be more out of touch with the masses depending. So it's relevant up to a point, but at the same time in a democracy, an ability to understand, to connect with ordinary people, feel their issues on the pulse, that may be equally, the moment there is no light at the end of the tunnel. In fact, there isn't even a tunnel in Parliament, because the majority in Parliament is a BJP majority, and they are the ones who organize themselves to shout me down. In fact, it's unprecedented. No one has been able to find for me a precedent where the introduction of a bill was blocked. Normally, you introduce anything, but then they'll defeat you in the discussion. To block the introduction was to convey a very strong political signal that such ideas are not. Which is why I have written that in the short term, or in the foreseeable future, the only hope for being fair to our citizens of that kind of persuasion is the judicial route. There is a review petition that has been admitted by the Supreme Court. When they hear that curative review petition, there is a hope that they might, as they have done on many other issues, that they might rule in favor of expanding the freedoms provided in the Constitution. Expanding the applicability of the freedoms are there, but it's how, with the changing of time, those freedoms can be interpreted to benefit people. This is what's happened in other democracies. If you look at the US over 200 years, they've hardly ever amended their constitution, and yet the meaning of certain phrases has been given greater depth and profundity in acknowledging the passage of time and in acknowledging the evolution of society. Equal rights, for example, overcoming racial discrimination, gender discrimination. All of these things have happened. In India too, a series of Supreme Court judgments has opened up the space much more for women. Women were denied rights in many ways under the old Victorian era penal code, and the Supreme Court has opened things up for them. So one would hope that they would also take an enlightened attitude towards those of another orientation. But at this stage, they have not scheduled the hearing, and we have to wait for them. But in Parliament, at least for the next 2.5 years of this Parliament, I don't see it. If there is a Congress majority ever, and the present leadership of the Congress party would certainly support it,